Okay, so, hey everybody. I'm just gonna go down and do the questions in the order that they're written in. So to answer the first question, which is, if you were a film director or screenwriter, how would you adapt the Decameron as a book, given that it is made up of more than 100 stories and a frame tale? So ideally, if I was to try to adapt the Decameron in like some kind of media, I would like to do it in a television show, just because there are so many different stories, and I would rather not have to leave anything out if I don't have to. And I think the best way to not have to leave anything out would be to do a television show. So what I would do is the pilot episode would be kind of the introduction, with a little bit of narration, and they would talk about like the 7 ladies and the 3 guys and how they escaped into the countryside, and it would like set everything up. And then each season would be one night or two, depending on how long the stories are and how long it would take to film everything. But so that's how I would do it as a television show. If I was to try to do it as a movie, I think you would have to get more creative. I think I wouldn't cut out any of the introduction or the interactions between the characters, because I think those are a very important part of the story. And what I would do is choose one story from every single night that I think best represents 3 categories. The first category for the story that I would pick is entertainment. The story would have to be entertaining and funny. So, for example, in the first night, one of the stories that I wouldn't pick would be the story where Saladin tries to trick the Jewish man into talking blasphemy about one of the religions. Because while it's a cool story and has a cool moral and like portrays the themes of the night really well, it's not particularly entertaining, and I don't think it would be fun to watch for an audience. And then the second category is the length of the story. You don't want it to be a story that's super duper short, because then you wouldn't be able to fill the runtime of the entire movie. For example, the short story with the monk who is sleeping with a lady and gets caught by his boss, the elder monk. I think that would not work particularly well as a story, just because it's so short, and you wouldn't be able to fill an entire movie with 10 stories like that. And you also don't want to choose stories that are too long and take up too much of the runtime, so that you have time for other nights. And then the third category would be, it has to translate one of the themes of the Decameron really well, specifically the theme of that night. So sticking with the example of the first night, if I was to choose one story to portray from that night, it would probably be it wasn't one of the assigned reading stories, but the second story in the first night. It was about the most evil man in history, a very, very evil, sinful man who tricks the priests on his deathbed into thinking that he was a super holy man who lived a super virtuous life, and ends up getting named a saint. And I told the story really quickly, but there is a lot more to it, and it is a little bit longer, but it's not super long. It communicates the theme of criticizing the church really well, and it was a very entertaining story. It was very funny. So I think that's how I would adapt the Decameron if it was to be in movie format. But television show would be a lot easier. You could just do, every episode is 1 or 2 stories from a night, depending on how long the stories took. So the second question is, what are the differences you noticed in Pasolini's adaptation of the story of Lisabetta de Messina when compared to the original novella? And I think one glaring difference, obviously, is that he didn't include the very ending of the story, where Lisabetta dies from her grief. So that was one of the huge glaring differences that I noticed between the two. And also, another difference was the reaction of the brothers to the news about Lisabetta, which was one of the brothers got like seethingly angry, like very upset, and started throwing almost like a temper tantrum in bed. And that wasn't something that we saw in the story. They were upset, but he never described any sort of temper tantrum and screaming and throwing things around. So I think that difference was done intentionally, just to try to paint the brothers in a bit of a worse light, which I think was a good decision, because it helps portray them as like crazy, evil, and insane. And I think that's a good way to do it. I think that adds to the story. And then another change was that the way Lisabetta got caught with Lorenzo was that one of the brothers was having sex with some random girl. And I think that was a really good change. I really like what Pasolini did with that, just because it increases the hypocrisy of the story, and the way that the brother was engaging in the exact same activities that Lisabetta and Lorenzo were, and yet he still finds it right to judge them and kill Lorenzo for doing the exact same thing that he was. So those are two like the major differences that I saw in the story when compared to the original. Outside of that, though, I think the adaptation was pretty faithful, surprisingly so. I thought it would deviate a little bit more from the Decameron and take a few more liberties, but it did not. And it was also very gruesome, very vivid, and it didn't shy away from any of like the nitty and gritty that was included in the Decameron, which again I really liked. I thought it was really cool. I also I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I like how the brothers were portrayed, because I think in the story they came across as almost like psychopaths, like they were insane. They seemed crazy. They killed a man for almost nothing and felt no guilt over it at all. Or even when their sister died, they still didn't really feel guilty. And I think that by having such a faithful adaptation, and then again adding the hypocrisy with one of the brothers, I think that Pasolini did a really good job at like showing that and portraying the brothers. And I think in this particular story, that is what he wanted the audience to focus on, just because he added a couple extra scenes about the brothers and their impact. But overall, with the rest of the stories as well that I saw in the movie, not just the story of Lisabetta, I think that Pasolini kind of focused on the depravity that was evident in the Decameron, and like the sinfulness, particularly focusing on sex and acts of like the sexual nature just in the last couple stories that I saw towards the end. But I think he wanted his audience to focus on like the sinfulness of humans and all that jazz. So yeah.